now. All right, and going to attendance now. I'm not going to see everybody while I'm reading your name, so please verbally say that you're here. Rory Stoltenberg.
Here.
Kevin McDermott.
Here.
Dan Butch.
Here.
Wood Hudson.
Here.
Alex Ikafuna. No, Alex. Christine Jacobs. I think Christine is in a training. Jeanette.
Here.
Stephen Johnson.
Here.
Tim Keller.
Here.
Jawan. I think Jawan said he was in an audit today, so he won't be joining us. Bill Palmer.
Here.
Sarah Pennington.
Present.
And Chuck Proctor.
Here.
Great. That's attendance. Thanks, Rory.
All right, so we'll read the statement now. The governor has declared a state of emergency to the COVID-19 pandemic, and the nature of this declared emergency makes it impracticable or unsafe for the CA MPO Tech Committee to assemble in a single location. This meeting and the required public hearings will be held utilizing electronic virtual communication with the Zoom software application and in accordance with virtual meeting procedures and policies as outlined in item 4.0-01 of the Virginia State Budget, HB 29, as effective April 24, 2020. This meeting will be recorded and made available to the public at www.tjpdc.org. And with that, we will go to matters from the public. Do we have any members of the public who would like to provide comment up to 3 minutes? If so, unmute yourself now. Nope. All right, then next up on the agenda is approval of the draft meeting minutes. Does anybody have any suggested changes to the minutes? I do have two, actually. There's minor typos in the planning work program item. I think it's bike and pedestrian crashed instead of crashes, and Wood's last name is missing a D. Other than that, they look good to me.
Great, we'll make those changes.
All right, so if no one else has any other changes, I would entertain a motion to approve. Tim? You're muted, but I think you
Motion
said
to approve.
Make the motion.
all right. Do we have a second?
Second.
All right, second from Stephen. I think a roll call vote is probably not necessary for this, so just raise your hand if all in favor. Any opposed? Motion carries. All right, so next up, we've got a study on Virginia bicycle crashes. Promises to be very interesting. So I'll pass it over to Erin. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Hi everyone, thanks so much for having me. My name is Erin Robartis. I'm currently a PhD student at the University of Virginia, and I'm going to be talking about some of the work that I did a few years ago as part of my master's research, and hopefully I can help share some of my experience working with Virginia bicycle data, what I've done, some of the limitations, and what could be done in the future. So I got involved in this work because I was interested in studying bicycle safety. So I'm going to talk about crash data, survey data, and then briefly what I'm doing now, which is working with bicycle simulator data. So if you're thinking about bike safety, then the first thing you might think about is crash data if you want to learn more about bike safety. So we have access to crash data when a crash happens, a police officer is called, and it's written up in a police report. This is often used for motor vehicles. It's also used for bicycle crashes, often when a bicycle is involved in a crash with a motor vehicle. So intuitively, you might expect that there are fewer bike crashes where the bicyclist is not very injured or not at all injured that would make it into this data set. The reporting minimum for police reported crashes is $1,500 when it's estimated that there's an injury or property damage that would be equivalent to that amount. So that's one drawback, but this is still one of the most comprehensive and uniform data sets that's accessible relating to bicycle safety. Hospital injury data is another one that's sometimes used. So to preface, this work was done in 2016. So the data was pulled from the Department of Motor Vehicles at the end of 2015. So it's a little bit older. If you went back and pulled the data again, you'd likely be able to get about twice as much information that we had access to at the time. So at the time that it was done, we had data from 2010 to 2015, and we only looked at single automobile, single bicycle crashes because that was the vast majority of the data set. A small subset included bicycle crashes or bikes where there were multiple automobiles in the crash, but we just focused on single automobile, single bike to keep it consistent. And during that 5-year period from 2010 to 2014, there were a total of 3,679 crashes. Our analysis only considers 2,435 of those that were not, that didn't have any missing data that we wanted to look at. So our goal was to look at how the characteristics of a crash influenced bicycle safety. So I have a few figures that provide some summary statistics about the data. So this is the first one is the full data set, the 3,000 plus crashes, and showing the number of crashes each year. So it looks pretty steady, maybe a slight increase, but it's hard to tell. It's only 5 years of data. And then the second one shows the injury distribution of all of those crashes. Again, the 3,000 plus crashes, the whole data set. And you can see here how most of them are in the minor/possible injury category. There were 45 fatalities in those 5 years. And there's a few where there is no apparent injury or no injury. And to clarify the difference between those two categories, no apparent injury is when there's no visible injury, but the person says that they might be in pain or something like that. So there could be an injury, but it's not visible. And then this last graph shows you the spatial locations of all the crashes, and not surprisingly, they're mainly clustered in more population dense areas. So this is likely giving us an idea of some exposure information, how many bicyclists are bicycling where. It doesn't mean necessarily Richmond is really unsafe for bicyclists. It just means there's probably a lot of people biking there. So to understand the crash characteristics that were available in the data set and how they impact the likelihood that a bicyclist might obtain a certain injury in the case of a crash, we did some modeling. So we used an ordered probit model, which lets us say we have these characteristics and what's the likelihood that under certain conditions, a bicyclist might end up with a severe injury or a minor injury. And the characteristics that we used from the data set included things like, was the driver or the bicyclist under the influence? What was the estimated automobile or bicycle speed? Vehicle types, so we know if the driver was in a passenger car or a larger car like an SUV. We had information about the grade and the curve of the road type, if it was a one-way road, separated two-direction road. And then we had information about weather, precipitation, the roadway surface, so if there was gravel or just a paved road, and the intersection type, so no intersection with multiple legs, a roundabout, things like that. So we got a number of results from this analysis, and I'm just going to go over some of the characteristics that had the greatest impact on increasing the likelihood of severe injuries and fatalities. So the factors that had the greatest impact were whether the driver of the car or the bicyclist were under the influence. So when the motor vehicle driver was under the influence, the likelihood of a fatality increased by just over 500%. and the likelihood of a severe injury increased by 114%. And then slightly less impactful, but still pretty meaningful, was when the bicyclist was intoxicated. And in that case, the likelihood of a fatality increased almost by 100%, and the likelihood of a severe injury increased by 37%. And then if we look at all of the crashes that resulted in a fatality, almost a quarter of them involved the bicyclist being intoxicated, and that is consistent with data that we see nationwide. Another factor that had an impact on increased likelihood of fatalities and severe injuries was speed, and that's intuitive for both the automobile and the bicyclist, and it's a finding that's supported by previous research as well. So if we look at the average speed that drivers were driving at in this data set, if we increase that by 1 standard deviation, then we see the fatality risk go up by 61% and the severe injury risk by 25%. And similarly for bicyclists, the average speed at the time of the crash was about 6.5 miles per hour. And if we increase that by 1 standard deviation, then we see the fatality risk go up by about 13% and the severe injury risk by about 6%. And then 2 more results that I wanted to share. The first, it has to do with the vehicle type of the motor vehicle involved in the crash. And we saw that when there was a larger vehicle, we see an increased likelihood of fatalities and severe injuries. This makes sense, of course. It's logical. If you have a bigger vehicle, more mass, it's capable of doing more damage. And this is something that's also been discussed recently in respect to pedestrian fatalities. In the US, there's an increasing percentage of people who are choosing to buy larger vehicles like SUVs and trucks over a passenger car. And we see here that when we look at an SUV as compared to a passenger car, we see the bicyclist fatality risk increase by about 50%. And then the last characteristic that I want to mention has to do with roadway geometry. So we know that roadway design is really important when we're thinking about vulnerable road users because it impacts how we force bicyclists and drivers to interact on the road. Unfortunately, this data set has no information about the bike facilities at the location of the crash. For example, if there's a bike lane or not, but we do have some information about whether or not the crash happened on a curve in the road, in which case the likelihood of a fatality increased by almost 100% and the likelihood of a severe injury increased by 36% in the case of a crash. Similarly, for roads that have a vertical grade, we saw increases in the likelihood of fatalities to be about 79% and severe injuries to be about 31%. So we were able to get some good information from this data set, although we uncovered some more limitations than we had realized at the beginning when we first considered using crash data. So in terms of bicycle safety equipment, there is some data about helmet use in this data set. It's a variable that has to be filled out. We should have good data. Unfortunately, it was miscoded in about half of the crash forms that we looked at, and there was no other information about other types of safety equipment like lights or reflectors or mirrors for the bicyclist. And there was also, as I said before, no information about bicycle infrastructure, bike lanes, sharrows, and things like that. And then, as I mentioned at the beginning, some of the limitations that we previously knew about, and that we suspect that the data is heavily underreported for minor injury crashes. And then the lack of exposure data when thinking about crashes is just something to consider. Like that one crash in an area that's rarely used by bicyclists might be more meaningful than a couple of crashes in an area that sees tons of bicycle use. And we just don't have statewide bicycle volume data for roads. So it's something that just doesn't exist. So you have to keep it in mind when thinking about how you understand crash data. So after completing this study, we were really interested in a couple of things. We thought about the two characteristics that had the biggest impact on the fatality probabilities, which were the drivers and bicyclists being under the influence. And we know about DUI laws, they're enacted, they've been shown to be effective. But BUI laws we were interested in, they're not as well known. They vary state to state. For example, in Virginia, it's legal to bicycle after drinking, and in other states it's not. So there's a couple of things to think about there. We saw in our analysis that biking and drinking had a negative safety impact, but also maybe we would rather people get on a bike than get in a car where they could potentially do more damage to others. So we pursued this avenue to see if we could study the impact of BUI laws, but ultimately we ran into a lack of data problem. And then similarly, after working with this data set, we were interested in looking at crashes and bike infrastructure, comparing the locations. But again, at the time, there wasn't enough data available across the state to match up crashes with known infrastructure locations. I believe that since we did this work, there's been more of a concerted effort to develop statewide maps of bike infrastructure. So this might be a more reasonable avenue to pursue now. And then the last thing that we decided to pursue was we wanted to make our own data set, put together a survey, send it out across Virginia, and get answers to some of the questions that we didn't get from the crash data set. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about that now. So our motivation for developing this survey was in response to some of the limitations that we saw in the crash data set. And some of the things we were interested in capturing with this survey were bicyclist crash histories, their use of safety equipment, their perceptions of bicycle safety, and their attitudes towards different policies and regulations. So we asked a lot of questions in this survey, so I'm just going to go over a few of the results that are directly related to the crash data that we just talked about. So the survey was distributed in the spring of 2017. The responses were primarily received through email because we targeted bicycle organizations and advocacy groups because we really wanted to hear about bicyclist experiences. As a result, our data set was a little skewed toward experienced bikers. We didn't get a lot of responses from casual bikers because of how we distributed it. But we did get about 686 responses, and 443 of those people actually finished the whole survey. So I pulled up some of the results on bicyclist safety equipment because that's something that we didn't get to see in the crash data set. So we asked a few questions. We asked about people using lights on their bike during the night or during the day. As you can see from these graphs, pretty much everyone said that they always use lights on their bike at night unless they don't bike at night. And then during the day, kind of an even split on whether people always, usually, sometimes rarely, or never wanted to use lights on their bike during the day. And then we also asked about helmet usage, and the vast majority of people said that they always wore a helmet. And we asked about reflective clothing at night, not as common as using lights, but still pretty common among the people that we surveyed. And then the last slide I wanted to pull up is on types of crashes. So we had a section of the survey where we asked people to report all the crashes that they had ever been involved in, and we asked for a lot of details about those crashes. So some of that information is available here. So the first 3 columns are crashes that involve just a single bike, so just themselves, no one else was involved. The next 3 where there were multiple bikes involved in the crash, and the last 3 columns are those crashes where there was a car involved. And then each set of 3 columns is broken down into no injury or no apparent injury. In the first column, the middle column is minor injuries, and the column on the right is severe injuries. And then, of course, we don't have any fatalities in this data set because everyone was filling out the survey, so they did not get involved in a fatal accident. So we can see that most of the crashes here were minor injury crashes, which is similar to what we saw in the crash data set, or the police reported crash data set. And we also asked people if the crash they were involved in was reported to the police, and those are the orange sections of the bars. So we can really visualize with this graph all the many types of crashes that bicyclists experience and how few of them end up in a data set like police reported crashes. And for this sample of crashes, 12% of them are highlighted in orange. And then I think it's smaller percentage, 9 total crashes where they weren't sure if they ended up in police report. So to wrap up, I'm going to briefly mention what we moved on to next after this work, where we really went all in on how can we collect more of our own data. So I work in the Omni Reality and Cognition Lab at UVA, where we have developed pedestrian and bicycle simulators. So if you can picture on the right, that's a person on a stationary bike wearing a virtual reality headset, and they're looking at, this is modeled after Water Street in Charlottesville. And so we can study their behavior and physiologic responses. We can put them in an environment that maybe doesn't exist or it's too dangerous to study them in real life. And we're hoping that this is a tool that in the future could be used to better engage public outreach, maybe in a situation where you're trying to get people interested or on board with a new road design project. So I wanted to share that, thought you all might be interested. And that's the end of what I have for you all today, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Wow, super cool. Thank you so much. I guess I'll open up the floor for anyone who has questions. I guess I'll start. I've got a question. So for the geocoding for these like data points, like how precisely are they mapped in these police reports? Like, can you get it right down to the exact spot that it happened?
Yeah, I believe it was longitude and latitude coordinates.
Okay.
So it was possible to just directly map that.
Cool. Yeah, I wonder if you could like, you know, use Google Street View plus like Mechanical Turk or something to code what the bicycle facilities on the street are, things like sharrows, see if they're visible. It seems like maybe there's enough or few enough that might be doable.
Yeah, that could be doable. You would also, I'm not sure if there's a tool in Google Maps to look at like previous iterations, but since a lot of the crashes are from like 5-10 years ago, then you would want to know what the previous facilities were as well.
Yep. Yeah, that is a thing in Google Street View. I'm not positive if the API has it, but definitely you can do it manually. Though obviously it depends on when the Street View, you know, van drove by. So it might not be precise to when it actually happened.
Yeah, I think at the time when we did this work, we contacted a number of cities and counties that did have GIS information about where their bike lanes were, but we just weren't able to get enough to match them up with enough crashes that had happened to get any kind of information.
Yep, that makes sense. Kevin?
I was going to ask, you had that data about like horizontal and vertical curvature in the road. Did you look at intersection related crashes versus segment related crashes, whether it was, you know, turning vehicles or turning bikes that were likely involved in the crash or a factor in the crash?
I don't think we had information about the turning movements, but there was data about the intersection types. So we did know if it was occurred on a straight corridor or if it occurred at an intersection that was either 3-legged, 4-legged, or roundabout, I think was how they defined all of them. And about 2/3 of the crashes occurred at intersections and the other third were on corridors.
Great, thanks. That's something that I always am curious about as to whether we're going to get further And I guess it would also be interesting to see how that relates to crash severity. I would assume that most of those crashes are probably less severe, whereas segment crashes are probably more severe because both the biker and the vehicle are going at higher speeds versus at an intersection when you would expect them to typically be slower speeds.
Yeah, that is what we saw in the data set, that there were more crashes at intersections, but they tended to be less severe.
Yeah, so trying to tease out where bang for the buck comes in for making improvements. Should we be focusing on improving intersections or improving long segments? That's an interesting piece of this. And then regarding the statewide data that you had, you mentioned that you couldn't tell if they were in places where a lot of people biked versus places where not many people biked. But were you able to separate out data by urbanized area versus more rural areas? Because I would imagine that could be a proxy for high bike versus low bike areas.
Yeah, I'm trying to recall if we did look into that. I don't 100% remember, but I can get back to you on that and check what we did. We might have done that because that would be a logical step, but yeah, I can get back to you on that if you're interested.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind if you have a chance just to see what other future evaluations we may want to try if we're looking into these topics. So that was all I had. Thank you, though. This was really interesting.
So we'll go to Tim next, and then Stephen.
Again, thanks. This is great to have the beginning of data on something that has been so rarely thought about that we need to be thinking about. I have two questions for you. The first one is, and I realize that we've added a lot of roundabouts in the Commonwealth since your study. Do you have any crash data on roundabouts?
Yeah, so there was information about whether there was a roundabout. So I'm sure there were some crashes that occurred at roundabouts, but I think that variable wasn't significant in our model, so we didn't include that. So I'm not sure about the impact of roundabouts on injury severity for this data set.
Sure, and I think as we add more, that's something that would be worthy of further investigation in the future. And I know,
but there is data in the data set about those crashes. So if you wanted to look further into the circumstances of crashes at roundabouts, it would be in that data set.
And I know that Joel and Kevin have spoken with us about modifications for crossovers before the roundabout for cyclists and pedestrians that are being taken into account. But it's just it's an interest area of mine. The second one is, you kind of alluded to a possible policy takeaway in terms of biker intoxication and Virginia not having that as an area for charge. Could you expand on that a bit more? And are there other potential policy takeaways that you haven't shared with us that you'd like to?
Yeah, so for the BUI policy, so in Virginia, there isn't a policy on biking under the influence. And I did look into every state in the US and how those policies vary. And there are a good amount of states that do have restrictions on biking under the influence. I think it's a little bit complicated because similar to like helmet laws, you don't want people to not choose to bike or choose to drive instead if the laws and the outcomes would be the same if they chose between them, because as a bicyclist you're so much less of a danger to other people if you're biking under the influence versus driving under the influence. But yeah, I looked into trying to get some kind of nationwide data set. I looked at fatality analysis reporting system data on bicyclists who were biking under the influence and trying to compare that to state laws to see if they had any kind of impact, but I wasn't able to get anywhere with that data. So I think that's still a little bit up in the air as to how effective those kinds of laws are.
And any other policy takeaways?
Not that I can think of at the moment.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Stephen?
I wanted to say I'm really intrigued by your use of VR in this project. And I was curious if you could talk a little bit more about the process around that. Like, how much time does it take to model Water Street? And as sort of a broader question for the group, does anybody know about planning consulting agencies or anybody like that who's using VR in like community visioning exercises instead of just like those pictures where you put your sticker, your sticker for the ones you want to vote for? Like, is anybody using VR to like put community members in different scenarios?
So some years ago, there was a community project to build SketchUp models of all the new proposals in the city, and in fact, like of the city as a whole. I think the Place Task Force was spearheading it, and it kind of, I think, fizzled out from lack of technical ability. But that's something I think about a lot as someone who bought a Vive in the very beginning of the pandemic.
So Aaron, how much work was it to build Water Street? I mean, how easy would it be to build other parts of the city? Or different versions of different parts of the city, or to show an evolution over time, like condense 20 years of development into a 5-minute VR experience?
Yeah, we worked with a consulting group to develop that environment, and it was definitely a lot of work. There are ways that you can get a more like a rougher kind of environment in VR using Google Maps, kind of like importing that environment and using that in VR, which has less realism, but is definitely quicker.
Might have to start teaching VR classes in planning school. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so the newest Microsoft Flight Simulator has that sort of Google Maps projected view, Stephen. And God, yeah, I would love to see this just on my own. As someone who lives on Water Street in this video, I think that would be super, super cool. Tim, you got more?
Well, I was just going to respond to that question and say that it seems to me that it's the logical next place that we're going to see planners and transportation planners going. I remember 30 years ago being at the Idea Lab at MIT, and they had a contract where they were doing VR scenarios for the drop-in forest fighters, you know, the ones that are airplaned in behind the lines, and that they were running real-time VR scenarios on what would happen with different wind current changes and that sort of thing. So it's, you know, the technology has been around for a long time, as I'm sure all of you know, and it's now that it's starting to become more an everyday occurrence. I imagine that the police folks at the joint unit over by University Airport in Milton is using that for scenarios right now. So seems pretty logical, especially if we could do that basic setup for areas that are really problematic. So you could use that baseline over and over for different types of tests that one wanted to do. Thanks.
So what can we do to help advance the research and do anything we can?
Well, we're moving forward with the VR research. We just completed the first study in our lab where we're aiming to validate the simulator and benchmark it against real world conditions. So in the future, I'm sure that we will be doing more experiments and looking for people to participate in them.
Great. We'll definitely keep us updated, and we'd love to hear any future outcomes of your work too, so we can put it in policy. Anybody else have any questions, thoughts? Lucinda? Oh, sorry. Just thought your hand was up.
Yeah, this is a really interesting study, and I was wondering if you were able to identify any areas in the Albemarle and Charlottesville area where there was a high incidence of crashes.
I don't think we looked that closely at individual cities. Yeah, I would have to look back at some of the mapping and see where the crashes fell in this area. But I could get back to you on that if you would like to know more about that.
It's okay, I was just wondering. And also, this is like really great. Is there a similar study for pedestrians?
I'm not sure.
Okay, thanks.
Cool. Anyone else have any questions, thoughts? All right. Well, thank you again, Aaron. This is super interesting. Really appreciate it. And I hope you don't mind that I live tweeted most of that.
No problem. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for being here. And will you be presenting this to MPO policy or other policymaking groups?
I don't have plans to present it in the future, but if there were opportunities where it would be helpful, I certainly could.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I think it's something that supervisors and counselors would be like. It would be great to have them see what drives bicycle crashes, since they're the ones who ultimately kind of decide what projects to submit and what projects to look at. So it would make a lot of sense if you've got the time and they're willing to have you. But thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Okay, so I guess we'll go to the next item on the agenda, which is the TAP application.
So Chris couldn't join us, so Jeanette will be presenting on that application. Jeanette, did you want me to bring up any of the files, or did you want to share your screen?
I will try and share my screen. Let's see. Can everyone see that little map?
Yes, we can.
Okay, wonderful. So this is the Meadow Creek Valley Trail System. There has been some past efforts to create a trail system. So the RTF have a kind of like a pig path through there. There was a timber bridge and staircase that was built in the 1990s that the Ravana Trail Foundation also built. But unfortunately, it's been severely damaged by storms and it was removed. The city has been working on the Meadow Creek restoration project. That's been complete. We have bought or had land donated to us to add additional parkland in this area. So we're looking at trying to build a 8-foot wide stone dust surface to open up this area to more users for bikes, pedestrians, people with disabilities. In 2018, we were awarded $375,000 under the TAP. But when looking at everything that we want to do, the project's actually going to come in closer to $1 million. So the city is going back and submitting a new application. This is what we're proposing for $500,000 with another $125,000 in local match to increase the grant to $625,000 to fill that hole. We're looking at PE and design work of $50,000. We also have a DCR recreational trail grant that we've been awarded of $325,000. So when you look at the map, let me see if I can go back to that screen. Oh, shoot. There we go. So we're talking really about this 8-foot new trail system, starting at Mickey Drive, running around the west side of Meadow Creek and connecting up to the proposed DCR bridge that's under development. Well, no, creating a new bridge for this with this grant. And then going to the east It would connect to another DCR bridge that would go to Greenbrier Park. And then also there is another section going into the county. So we're going to have to work together on this to also make another connection at Greenbrier Drive. So that is what the Parks Department is proposing to submit. Are there any questions? Shoot.
Yeah, I got a quick question. I mean, not a question, maybe more of it. Will this essentially be kind of similar to what's further downstream at like Greenbrier Park, that kind of surface and situation?
It would be stone dust. So packed stone dust. So if that's what's at that park, then yes.
Yeah, it's like, it's pretty nice. It's like, it goes all the way to the railroad abutment and seems heavily used these days.
Gotcha.
So I remember when like the schools first came back to in-person, you had the videos from the progress of like kids from Mickey Drive, like literally like using a rope bridge across the creek to get to school. Like, is this going to be an alternative safe path to school for them? I can't remember if they were going to Greenbrier or somewhere else.
I'm not quite sure where the students would be going on this. Possibly.
Fair. I will ask Catherine Knox. But if it is, and I think
Rory,
it is, it'd be super useful.
I do know, Rory, that where that says BDCR bridge, that's like that rope bridge. I think I remember seeing on that news site. So it looks like that. It looks the same right now, but it sounds like that's a separate project because they're using the RTF trail right now and crossing there.
Gotcha.
If there's no more other questions, the city is also going to be submitting another TAP grant. We don't have any material yet to show you all, but it would be for programming, and it would be to support our Safe Routes to School coordinator position. So Amanda Ponce just wanted me to let you all know about that as well.
Cool. And what will the action items be for us, just to endorse the grant application?
I believe, yes, just to endorse or recommend for endorsement this application, acknowledge that, yes, we're going to be submitting another grant later on. And then that too will be presented to the policy board.
Great. And is there going to be like a local match for these, or is it totally state funded?
This one is 500,000 is what we're asking for state or federal money. And then 125 would be the local match for this trail project.
Cool. Seems pretty reasonable. And then last thing, like I know there's that like Seminole Square shopping center redevelopment proposal for like that bit by the empty where the Kroger was supposed to move in, the old Giant, I guess. Is there like some, I mean, can't quite tell if it like actually impacts their land, but like, is there some way we can like work with those property owners to get some of this done, or do we need to coordinate with them, or is this kind of standalone and they don't really matter?
Everything in green is currently Parks land. I know Parks is interested in possibly moving the trail away from the creek, so that would avoid, you know, flooding. So we would be working with them and asking them. And if there is a proposal that actually does move forward, I know there's been, it seems 3 or 4 with this property, Seminole Square Shopping Center, that if something actually materializes, yes, Parks is definitely going to be involved in site plan review and requesting what their objectives could also work with what the private property owner, what they're planning to do.
Awesome. Yeah, and like a connection up to Dan Road or something to connect with the new pedestrian bridge would be, I think, really helpful too. Get more access, especially, you know, with the hydraulic small area plan. That whole area is supposed to be a residential center eventually. This is great. Thanks.
Okay, wonderful.
Anyone else have questions, thoughts, comments? All right, well, thanks, Jeanette.
All right, thank you.
Next up on the agenda is going to be the tip adjustments. We'll go to Lucinda for that.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to share my screen, and I have a presentation that I did for the CTAC committee, but it has it's kind of the basics of, here we go, the basics. Can you guys see that on your screen? No.
Can't see anything yet.
There we go. Okay, now you should see it. It's kind of the basics of tip adjustments and amendments, and I didn't know if you wanted me to go through that for you at this time. I'm gonna skip it unless somebody speaks up and says that they'd like me to go through the basics of the tip adjustments and amendments, because I think you all probably are familiar with the tip. Okay. So I'm just going to inform you today about some adjustments that were made in the last couple of months. The first one was an adjustment requested by CAT, and the Virginia Department of Rail and Public Transportation moved all of the flexible STP funding to FTA 5339 funding. So that was just the affected blocks are listed on the slides. And it was just a move of money. There's no change in the amounts or anything. There's no changes in projects. The next adjustment, why didn't that go? There we go. The next adjustment is just they purchased some equipment before they were planning on doing it. So they just moved it from one fiscal year to the next fiscal year. But there were some jaunt adjustments, and this was in order to ask for more money. They were planning on asking for more money, so they increased some amounts for funding for replacement buses and fleet operations. It wasn't a lot of money. It's not really changing anything. For also funding for support vehicles, and the mobility management project funding just moved from 5310 to 5311 funding. Then there were also some additional funds allocated to CAT and jaunt's operating funds. So there was an increase in operating funds for each of those. And I think that's it. Yep, that's all there was. Any questions?
Do you know what the 5339 funding is? That's just one I'm not familiar with, and I'm curious what the purpose of that code is.
I do not know. I can look it up and get back to you.
That's grants for buses and bus facilities. We're no longer receiving or allocating Flex STP due to the way that there's an agreement between DRPT and VDOT on that funds. And my understanding is we're just not allocating that anymore. So those projects that we're receiving Flex STIP, which was mainly our small urban agencies that receive 5307 funds, are now using 5339 to kind of balance out that loss of Flex STIP monies. You know, all are both Flex STIP and 5339 were federal dollars.
And intended for capital for buses is what you're saying?
Yeah, buses and bus facilities, so capital improvement.
Okay, thanks, just curious.
I've got a question about the jaunt. Wait, are we still just on the CAT part, or are we doing all the tip adjustments here?
We're doing them all.
Okay, cool. So I noticed in the footnotes that John is planning to kind of increase the percentage of electric vehicles in its fleet replacement up to, by FY24, it'll be 3/4 of the new vehicles will be electric. So, I mean, I don't know, I guess I'm all for electrification. Climate change obviously is something I think is super important to address, but almost everything I've heard is that like buses are one of the worst applications for battery electric vehicles, mainly because they're driving around all day and they don't really have a time to stop and recharge for a long time unless they have swappable batteries or something. And obviously John isn't fixed route, so maybe it's a little bit different. So I'm curious, like how, if we can get a status report maybe from Stephen of like how the electric vehicle pilot has been going and whether it's been effective or, you know, has to go out of service for long periods or how that all works.
I can speak to that a little bit, and I'm happy to go get additional information that I could bring back next time. Right now, our investment in electric vehicles is pretty small. We've got one electric bus, and then we've got a couple of electric staff vehicles. And we've got one charging station, I believe, here at our facility. Unlike CAT buses that have a schedule to run all day, with demand response service, there's a little bit more flexibility in when and how we deploy our vehicles. And historically, our demand curve is not linear over the course of the day. We see really big peaks in demand during commuter hours, so mornings and afternoons. So there actually is a pretty significant reduction in our passenger demand around lunchtime, and that creates opportunities for us to come back and charge the vehicle if we need. That being said, I haven't done a conductive interview process with our drivers of the electric vehicles or the mechanics to get their perspectives on how well those vehicles are working for us. That's something that I would be happy to go get more information on. I think in the past, John's attitude was a pioneering one that we are interested in exploring this. We have put some pretty ambitious targets out there about what percentages of our fleet we would like to be electric. I think that this year will probably be a good time for us to reflect on the experience we've had so far with our limited investment, as well as making sure we're coordinating with DRPT to make sure that our vision for what we'd like to procure and what they're seeing at the state level and in terms of providing finance, we want to make sure we're on the same page there.
Great,
Stephen,
thanks.
do you want to mention that you're also going to be doing a electric vehicle readiness study in FY22 through DRPT's TA grant program?
Yeah, obviously my head is not that far out right now, but yeah, we do have that study coming down the pipe, and we're excited to get more information.
Great, yeah, I'm very interested in the results of that, and you know whether those buses end up having fewer revenue hours, and whether the fleet readiness works when they're expanded up to the whole fleet. I definitely appreciate the idea of electrifying vehicles, but I don't want to see innovation for the sake of innovation if it means worse service for customers, especially given that obviously transit gets people out of their personal vehicles, and it's overall inherently more climate efficient. So I think the most important thing is that we get more people taking transit to get them out of their polluting vehicles. So I see that 6 electric buses are planned for FY21, which is what, almost over, right? Is that still the plan? And then I guess for the out years, like, is this tip flexible enough that that could be adjusted as necessary?
Wood, I see you shaking your head. Do you want to respond to that?
The tip is a local document maintained by MPOs and in consultation with transit agencies. So the flexibility really is up to you all in terms of changing out years and stuff. I mean, we realize that there is difficulty in forecasting 5 years out in terms of revenues and expected needs. But so we do expect changes. That's why there's the modification process baked into the whole tip game.
That makes sense. Thanks.
And I'll ask one more question to you, Wood. It wasn't on my plate to look at our last round of vehicle requests. I know that we requested a pretty significant number of electric vehicles, but you know, going forward, is there a process by which Jaunt or any other transit agency will be able to say, hey, we'd like this number of electric vehicles, but if you decide not to fund that, please give us gas vehicles instead and not no vehicles?
That's probably a question for the program management side of the house. That might be something that you could specify in your applications. You know, generally all vehicles are scored based on their age and mileage and reaching the particular benchmarks for the kind of vehicle. And then that's scored against kind of needs across the state. So, you know, I think if you could justify the case for vehicles that are aging out, potentially, but, you know, I don't want to misspeak and say, yes, you know, we'll just add a checkbox there when you're applying for an electric vehicle kind of thing.
Yeah, I think we can pretty clearly make the case when a vehicle needs to be replaced, but my question is, with what? And we want to make sure that we're not shooting ourselves in the foot if we say we want electric vehicles and you balk at that and then we get no vehicles.
Yeah. Absolutely. And that's you know, we can have that conversation offline.
Sure.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess I'd acknowledge also that like the flip side of EVs having to be charged is that they also have much lower maintenance needs. So maybe that offsets the unavailability. And yeah, I mean, I'd be very interested to see how it's been going so far. And I imagine, you know, it's not just locally that we'll be interested in that, right? You know, typically, you know, purpose of innovation is to kind of set an example and pave the way and see how it goes. So I imagine other agencies around the country would be very interested to see how it's gone for you, what the challenges have been, and what the benefits have been. So I'd be very interested in that report. And then separately, I've noticed that the quantity of buses goes up fairly significantly, you know, from 89 to 104, so 50 new buses in the next 4 years. Is that because of an increase in demand, because of unavailability, because of electric charging, or some combination, or?
Yeah, it can vary widely because of the replacement schedule. There's a certain mileage replacement as well as a number of years replacement. So I think right now we're in a phase where every couple of years we're getting a pretty big increase and then we don't see as large an increase. It's just the particular mileage and timing of our fleet right now. We're also trying to strengthen our vehicle reserves a little bit so that we're not as stretched for vehicles if we have some down for maintenance. All that being said, you know, the Washington Post just reported that they expect commuter patterns to decrease for WMATA, and it's to be determined how quarantine is going to affect our demand patterns. So the way that we projected our demand growth in our last RTP, that might be totally wrong now. And I'm not sure any transit agencies have an answer to that today about how quarantine is going to affect our need for buses.
Yeah, that makes sense. Also, I guess, so this tip block is specifically for replacement, but it also includes, or it implies that 15 additional new buses. Is that just in a different like line item that isn't being edited here? Is that where that's coming from?
I will need to go back and review that and compare that to our RTP.
Cool. Thanks. Does anyone else have any questions or comments on the tip adjustments? And do we need to take an action today? No action?
No.
Okay. Great. So then I guess we will move on to the Unified Planning Work Program. So I'll hand it over to Sandy. Thanks.
Thanks, Rory. We talked about this last month, and I'll go ahead and share my screen just to update you all. You all had made some recommendations. If you recall, we had prepared the draft work program based on some outstanding unknowns for what projects would actually be included in the work program at that time. So we had presented a couple of different options and asked for you all to make a recommendation to the policy board on what would actually go in the work program. So we did that, and the policy board, although we did present you all's recommendation, the policy board ultimately decided that right here is where we had the to be determined projects, and we had a budgeted amount of $50,684, and we had a couple of different options that we had presented to you all. The policy board ultimately decided, though, that the climate action initiatives were their highest priority. They did not feel strongly about the other option that we had paired with it, which was basically doing some in-depth case studies on revenue opportunities where other localities had generated additional revenue studies. So what they had asked us to do was to go ahead and include the climate action initiatives into the work program for this fiscal year 22. And then they asked for the remainder of that amount. That was for $30,000. They asked for the remainder of that $20,684 to basically be set aside for something that might come up either throughout the year or potentially to go to another project moving forward if we didn't have the right opportunity this year. And so that is reflected in this on-call services line. The amount that I had originally programmed in there just to support general kind of support for things that might come up that we didn't necessarily foresee at the beginning of the year was 5,000. So you can see that I added that 20,000. There is a typo in the memo in your packets. I apologize for that. This table was not updated with the correct numbers, but I did correct it for this table right here. So this is the final work program has been prepared. We have a public hearing that is scheduled for the policy board meeting next week for them to hopefully officially approve this document. But this is what our work program looks like. Just as a general refresher, we're going to continue the Route 29 North Corridor study that we started this year. We're going to be looking at developing our scope of work for our next long-range transportation plan update, as well as doing some strategic planning, which will hopefully help us develop these work programs moving forward once we identify what the priorities and opportunities are for our MPO based on all the stakeholders. Then we'll be looking at these climate action initiatives, which is going to be a lot of reviewing what other places are doing, looking at what data is available, and seeing what we can do as far as performance measures are concerned that we can incorporate into our long range planning process. And then we have this $25,000 that we could put towards another initiative or another opportunity that might come up throughout the year. And then the rest of this is stuff that projects that we normally are involved with regardless, smart scale, tip updates, performance targets, things like that. And then we also have this line item for public outreach to help engage the public well and provide background information. But if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer those at this time. Otherwise, we'll just be asking for you all to make a recommendation that we will communicate to the policy board when they vote on this.
Yeah, I guess I'd just say, obviously we had a pretty robust discussion last time, and a little sorry to see that the bike crash study came out of it or was removed, but that presentation by Erin was great. So I guess kind of makes up for it, which I think more reason to get her to present to policy and more formally like present those findings, I think.
Sure.
But we get to see climate action. And maybe it makes sense to do it now to coordinate with the city. Obviously, is doing climate action plan. The county recently adopted one. Is that right, Tim? Cool. So I guess I would entertain a motion or other thoughts.
To motion to recommend approval to the Board of Supervisors for the UPWP.
That's right. Was that a motion or was that just a question?
That was my motion. Sorry.
All right. Do we have a second? Tim will second. And do you want to do a roll call vote for this one, Jessica? Does that work? Or
why don't we just raise hands, and if it doesn't look like it's a clear vote, then we can go by person.
For me, all in favor, raise your hand. Any opposed? Raise your hand or speak up. Any abstentions? All right, motion carries. So we'll recommend that work program for approval. Next up, we got our smart scale submissions. So back to Sandy again.
Sure. So as you all will recall, we have our timeline that we're going through with our smart scale project identification process. So I put this helpful red arrow here so you'll know where exactly we are. So at this point, we're really just looking at finalizing our projects for that we're going to be giving the policy board for them to choose from on which ones they want to pursue moving forward. And they're going to be informed. We're going to ask for you all to help inform that which ones that we want them to move forward. So at this point, I'm just going to go through what our potential slate of projects are. And I don't know how many of you besides Jeanette and Kevin and Dan might have jumped on the webinar. I couldn't see who the attendees were, so I apologize for any overlap in information that you might have heard. But I do want to just make sure that you all are aware of what we're considering and see if there's anything else that we need to discuss as far as whether or not there are other projects that need to be considered, or anything that you want to make sure is considered as part of that discussion with the policy board moving forward. So as we had talked about before, we had looked at projects where we started with the high priority list in the long range transportation planning document that we currently have. And then we also looked at existing plans that had recently been completed. We wanted to be moving projects forward towards through a pipeline, an identified pipeline where projects had already been identified, keeping that momentum moving forward on those. So this is what generated these projects. And just a reminder that the District Avenue Roundabout project and Hillsdale Avenue, those both came out of the hydraulic 29 study, the Ravana River bike and pedestrian crossing. We completed a feasibility study with VDOT last year. The Avon Street bike and ped improvements is a high priority need that had been identified by the city and their master bike and pedestrian plan, as well as just recently had a completed small or corridor study by Albemarle County. And then Fifth Street, VDOT just recently completed a corridor study. I think most of you all are probably pretty aware of the District Avenue Roundabout. At this point, though, if you all have any questions or want to discuss these projects, I think this might be a good opportunity to do that, just so we have information that we can take to the policy board. But I'll open it up, especially to Chuck and Kevin and Jeanette, and see if there's anything else that you all want to add as far as whether or not you think there's support from your localities or the competitiveness of these projects or anything like that. Or if any of the rest of you have any questions, I think this can be a pretty open discussion just to make sure that you have information you need to determine what you think would be the best opportunity for the MPO right now.
I'll know for sure after our meeting on Wednesday. I think I have heard from the supervisor in this district that she supports this project. I think we're going to have to relook at that design now, because I don't know if we have all that land available on the parking lot that you see there getting partially covered, because there is an approved development that is moving forward there. So reevaluation of that concept may be necessary, but I think there's general support.
Sure. Okay. Any other questions on that one or feedback?
And so what would be the impact of the increased right of way? It looks like one house in the city and then some amount of that parking lot, and then is that it?
Chuck, are you able to answer that?
I mean, this is a really high level concept. With the changes that Kevin's talking about, we may have to look at it more closely to see what the full impacts of it are. Generally, we are going to impact those properties on all 4 quadrants. It's just to what extent we do, and shifting that footprint around. We've got the movie theater on the one corner, and if there's a building on the other corner, we'll have to look at it and see if we can even fit one in there without, with the impacts that they're going to have without impacting more properties. I don't know at this point.
Yep. And Kevin, does that new building go like actually all the way up to the corner?
It doesn't go all the way to the corner, but I think it goes closer to this, especially when you're considering the grade that you're dealing with there.
Yep. Thanks.
Any other questions or discussion on this one? Okay. Move on to the next one. This was the Hillsdale Avenue extension. This was actually submitted in the previous round of Smart Scale, so it's still an option that we would consider. And it would also be removing these ramps between 250 and 29 and redirecting them through this Hillsdale Avenue extension to help reduce some of the impact points throughout this corridor. Any questions on this one or anything anybody else wants to add?
I guess I would just say, actually, the U's who own Szechuan reached out to me randomly the other day just to ask about the timeline on that. And I told them it wasn't selected last time, so that's pushed out 2 years. I think at that point they'll be planning on retiring anyway, but it might make sense to engage them, and I'd be happy to put you in touch.
Sure. Yeah, for some of these, we probably will want to, at least for the 29 projects, at a minimum, even if these aren't picked up by the policy board to be the ones that we do that intensive stakeholder outreach, we'd probably at a minimum want to at least review them with the 29 panel and maybe some other stakeholders prior to submitting an application. Did you want to say something, Chuck?
Yeah, the only thing I'd like to say is I know with the approval of the current projects, we definitely have to relook at the intersection and hydraulic because that's going to be a roundabout now. So that would change that connection to more of a 2-lane with an island in the middle, and the crosswalks would be pulled back a little bit. But we basically have a stub out from that project that we would tie into this project with.
All right. The next one on the list is, I think you all had a presentation late last year on this already, but the Ravana River Bike and Pedestrian Crossing, which we initially did the feasibility study. We've identified 2 general configurations that would work for this crossing. And Jessica could actually speak more on that. But again, if this was picked up, we'd have to determine which one of those configurations, or maybe if there's another configuration we want to consider, we would start with what's already been in the feasibility study, though, to determine what makes the most sense and how to make those connections to the broader bicycle and pedestrian network. Anything, Jessica, Chuck, the rest of you, anything you want to add on this one? Nope. Okay. All right, and then the Avon Street multimodal improvements. Again, this would be putting together, I think this is one that if it's picked up, we're going to have to put a lot of public and stakeholder engagement into it, because it would really be taking recommendations from both the city and the county and working with a stakeholder group to determine how to put together a package of projects that will that are the highest priority for that entire corridor. A question did come up in the public webinar, whether we could submit one package with all of the improvements, and potentially we could. The concern is just whether or not that would actually be competitive for funding at the cost of doing everything in one package. So that would basically be something that we would have to define, take what's already been recommended and pulling out what makes sense for one or potentially two applications for smart scale for projects. Jeanette, Kevin, especially, anything you want to say on this one?
Nothing in particular. It's just that these projects that you're now showing, the pedestrian bridge, the improvements on Avon, the improvements on 5th Street that you're going to start talking about, from the staff's perspective, this is what we're most interested in. Basically because it's multimodal, but also because we have so much investment already going to the north of the city that we do want to spread out these improvements. We don't want to have one area that's perfect and the rest of the city with a fractured infrastructure. So focusing on these really high volume corridors, improving the backbone of our multimodal system, and then working from there. So the other two, the Hillsdale extension and the Roundabout, to us, those are less important than these three that we're discussing now.
Sure. Yeah, and the other thing I want to mention is that we have these broken up into 5 different sort of top areas to consider. One of the recommendations that we can discuss more next time when we actually need to guide the policy board, give them some recommendations to make decisions on, is that we could just say that there are 2 or 3 priorities and plan that more than one application might come from looking at the Avon Street multimodal improvements. Maybe we just plan to submit 2 or 3 applications on that one. So that's also something else to be considering as you think through what, the priorities might be, especially, since you all are representing your local governments as staff and as planning commissioners, to think through whether or not that might make the most sense to, support the networks that you all want to, create or prioritize. And so then the last one is this 5th Street multimodal improvements corridor. And so this would be looking pretty similar to the Avon Street corridor. We would be looking at pulling out kind of a package or 2 of projects that we could combine to put into an application. So this would be looking at both interstate improvements and also bike and pedestrian infrastructure improvements as well, to think through how those correlate and how we can plan better to make improvements on both of those factors. So are there any questions or comments on this one?
Jeanette, is the city planning on submitting one for further up this street? I know there was talk about like a roundabout last year at Paley, I think.
Yes, while the MPO is looking at their projects, the city itself is looking at ours, and that is certainly one of the higher ones. It's higher priority in our planning documents, and there's also been a lot of citizen input and support. There's been a study done. So yes, we would propose that be one, at least one.
Mm-hmm. And that's something else.
Kevin, could you speak to the county part of that, just as the city was spoken to?
Yeah, we're in, actually, I just had a conversation with Chuck about this the other day. We are looking at, well, of course, there is already an existing funded project at Old Lynchburg Road, and we're looking to combine how that works with the rest of these. There was a suggestion made that the Stagecoach Road intersection is the next highest priority for us, and including ped facilities between connecting the Old Lynchburg Road project to Wahoo, or from Wahoo Way to Stagecoach Road. So we're in support of the projects that we're looking at here. Just need to kind of figure out what the what the highest priority is.
Thanks.
Sure. So those are the projects that we would move forward. I think some of them obviously would need a little bit more engagement than others. Clearly, you know, if it's one of the hydraulic projects, we probably still need to reconvene the stakeholders that have already been working on that to finalize a design submission. But if it's something like the Avon Street or Fifth Street, that's going to take a lot more sort of engagement with a advisory panel or steering committee to really define what those project applications are going to look like. So we just wanted to get this finalized list in front of you and see, is there anything else that we should be considering that might come up either as a priority for the local areas that we have not considered at this point, and give you all that opportunity as well. Yeah, Kevin.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start. Because we're moving on this so early this year, it's still very fluid. Of course, I have a presentation in front of the board tomorrow to discuss some of these projects in addition to others that we may be looking at. But just even just over the past week, Chuck has told me that there is a lot of VDOT interest in a couple other projects in the area. One being, and they were mentioned briefly at our last meeting on this, the Pantops project up right at the top of the hill, basically from the end of our previously funded project to the other funded project. So it's between the diverging diamond through Peter Jefferson Place all the way up to the intersection where the Giant is and all that. So he is recommending that we try and move forward with a study for looking at that area, multimodal improvements, especially a potential park and ride. And I'm gonna bring that up to the board tomorrow, even though I had not really proposed that in the past to them. And then another project is the 22-250 intersection that VDOT is interested in studying as well. It's a high priority for us. It's a very high crash location. It's very problematic. So I think, you know, staff supports both those projects, and we'd like to see if the board supports us putting those resources, small amount of resources, into working with VDOT on studies to potentially come up with a couple projects there.
And just to clarify, Kevin, are those also ones that you potentially would like the MPO to consider as part of their smart scale applications, or is that just something in addition that you're going to discuss with the county what direction they want to take with that?
I think, you know, we're kind of getting into that question of whether or not it's MPO or TJPDC. Okay. I don't even know if, I think 22 may not even be in the MPO area, 22 intersection, or if it is, it's really close.
Okay.
So, it depends, I guess. Yes. We're interested in possibly you all submitting those for us.
Gotcha.
Yeah, the MPO boundary goes all the way to the county line, so that's well within the area for the MPO. But a TJPDC too. Yeah, those were locations that are identified in the VTrans plan, and we were slated. The state developed a new process for identifying locations that had great needs across the state. We had to identify 5 locations in our district that met that tier 1 priority need, and both these locations fall under that criteria. So we were looking to get studies done in those areas. Not that we necessarily have to submit them for smart scale, but just so we can develop recommendations for future applications, or if any other funding comes down the pike that we could use to make improvements at those locations. So these were the 2 areas that had the most potential for us in the MPO area that we wanted to pursue through that mechanism.
Okay.
I guess my question, Chuck, is can you share what those 5 locations are?
Well, one of them is it's Pantops, and it goes from, like Kevin said, it's the current project ends at Hanson's Road, which is right there by the SunTrust Bank before you get to Rolkin as you're coming up the hill from Stony Point, and it goes all the way to 64. It's basically that corridor of 250. We're looking at multimodal, possible some transit options, park and ride lot, because there's a lot of needs in that area for those locations, for that improvement. The one at Shadwell is out there at the 22-250 intersection. We also included the 729, which is North Milton Drive intersection. That area is another area where we have, like Kevin said, a lot of crashes, and it's one of our tier 1 needs. The other 3 locations are up in the northern part of the district. One of them is at 17 and 28 in Fauquier County on the Bealton area. Again, that's an intersection where we're seeing a lot of high crash incidences occur. On the northern side of the town of Warrenton, Business 29 from Broadview Avenue all the way to the 17 interchange as you're going into the northern part of town of Warrenton. Then the other intersection was the 29-605 intersection, which is also in Fauquier County, just north of the town of Warrenton. So those are the 5 intersections that we considered for this work. We looked at the tier 1 needs, and we tried to identify locations where we didn't have studies that cover those areas. So those are the ones that we had already identified. There was another location, but we're already studying it, and that's on the northern corridor study of 29 in Albemarle County. We've already have a study that's currently underway at that location, so we didn't want to. We could have considered that as one of those 5 locations, but I wanted to try to see if I could find a separate location that we wanted to consider.
Thanks for sharing that. I was just in Warrenton on Sunday, and in all 3 of those locations you discussed around there, and I can certainly attest that they are right up there with the ones for around here.
We presented them to our CTV representatives, and they were amenable to those, and they're actually being presented at the CTV today. So. And they're going to vote on those moving forward. And I think those studies will probably kick off sometime early in June is what we're shooting for.
Could you talk a little bit more about the park and ride concept? Is that on Pantops? Or I guess, like, what is the ride? Because, like, Route 10 is pretty low frequency and long duration out there. Maybe that's going to change with the Albemarle transit expansion plan, or is it like way out in Shadwell with like a jaunt connector?
We don't necessarily have a location identified. We're going to try to investigate a location. Since we lost the park and ride lot at the bottom of the hill at the shopping center, we lost a lot there. So we don't really have a lot other than there's one out at Dardental Park, but it's not really utilized because it's so far removed. So I want to try to get something close to the interchange in the Pantops area that we could get more utility out of and that we could connect bus service to, because I think that will benefit both the city and the county and the commuters that are coming in and out of the locality. So that's what we're going to try to look at as part of that. I know with the 64 study, we had looked at a number of lots along the corridor. We didn't look at this one. And there actually may be some opportunities with the 64 interchange project to where there might be a site in that area that we might want to consider there too, as this. But I want to try to see where we can identify a site for this area, because this is definitely one of the locations where we need one.
And do we have a sense of like what the utilization of that lot we lost was, or the ridership there?
I don't recall. We probably have numbers on the one that was at the shopping center. When I reviewed it before, it's had a lot of utility. So there was highly utilized. And I think some of the lots around in the Pantops area are utilized, but there's not really a unified location and it doesn't have good transit service. So I think if we can look at opportunities for all of that to combine, especially with the bridge across the Ravana, I think we're going to see a lot of nexus in this area to where people have options that they could drive, park here, and then commute into the city via other modes to get them into their jobs and out, or for even tourism.
Yep.
If I could just quickly add a couple of things about the park and ride locations, since those are a joint venture between VDOT and Rideshare. The Pantop Shopping Center, when it changed ownership, they requested to no longer have the park and ride lot there. The lot was mostly used by 2 van pools that we had that went to Richmond. We obviously had to relocate those 2 van pools, and unfortunately the Darden Tow lot did not work for them because it's restricted by park hours, and the park closes at dark, which in the winter would not work for any commuters given how early it gets dark. I believe both of the van pools are at the Avon Street lot now, which kind of works and kind of doesn't depending on where everyone is coming from. It's got fairly decent 64 access, but it's still not really quite right there.
That makes sense. And is that something you guys have like approached the parks departments about, like potentially expanding hours or specifically keeping that lot open at Darden Town?
I have not specifically. It's my understanding that, you know, they lock the gates and that's kind of that.
Gotcha.
And, you know, I don't know how much that would change the use because, again, kind of like Chuck said, it's not exactly the most convenient location for where it is, unless, you know, if you're going to 64, I would say. Maybe if you're going, you know, up 20 or something like that, it might be a little bit better. In my 10 years, I don't think that lot has ever been utilized by more than 1 or 2 cars.
Gotcha. Thanks.
So just as far as next steps, I just wanted to have this initial discussion so we can put together a list of, you know, what projects we're going to be considering. And then next time we meet again in July, we'll be asking for you all to provide some recommendations to the policy board on which projects you would like them to prioritize as far as both submissions and as far as additional engagements. So that's what we will be asking you to do next month or in 2 months from now.
Thanks. And yeah, I just add that I very much agree with Jeanette about that I prefer or really like to see the focus on those corridors in the south side of the city. They're both pretty dangerous and underserved corridors for multimodal right now. Obviously, we had all those fatalities on Fish Street last year. And honestly, selfishly, I have a coworker who commutes to work on an electric longboard from the Woodlands up Fish Street, or at least did when we went to work. And it'd be really inconvenient for me if he got into an accident on that longboard on Fish Street. So multimodal improvements there would be fantastic for many people, I think. Anyone have any other thoughts on Smart Scale? All right, well, we're running well ahead of schedule here, so good job, everybody. So it's time for roundtable updates. Does everybody have any updates? We want to just go around the room one by one. I guess we'll go with that. All right, so I'll go counterclockwise on my screen. Let's start with Tim. You're on mute.
I don't even know what the roundtable updates mean. Nobody's told me.
I guess just any updates that are happening in the county that you feel might be germane to the rest of the group.
I think Kevin has hit on a lot of them. We will be interested to see what happens tomorrow.
Sounds great. All right, Bill, any updates from UVA?
Not too many. We have another round 2 of graduation this weekend, so traffic will probably be impacted again. But beyond that, our operational schedule remains kind of how it has been. I think the bus schedule will, I don't know if they're curtailing it because it's pretty curtailed already, but they'll mostly be focusing on servicing like the health system, bus routes and things like that. And then we'll see what happens in the fall and if they are planning to increase bus frequency or not. It has a lot to do with what the social distancing rules and all that are.
Great. Dan?
I think Kevin covered it. We'll know a lot come tomorrow on direction for upcoming next year's smart scale and revenue sharing applications that we're bringing to the board tomorrow. Kevin's leading the charge on that one, but I'm always in support. Anything else, Kevin?
Yeah, I can go next. Like I said, tomorrow will be a big day to figure out where we, what direction we're going in on upcoming projects, not just the smart scale for 2022, but we're going to be talking about the revenue sharing projects for 2021, including potentially the Eastern Avenue Southern connection in Crozet to connect from the West Hall neighborhood down to the Corey Farms neighborhood to 250 to see if that's something that we're going to be moving forward with. Also asking about potential Avon Street corridor project. Excuse me. The other things that are going on are the Crozet Master Plan implementation project meeting is coming up in a few weeks, and we've been talking a lot about the projects that are going to be recommended in that master plan. We've completed a transportation study of the Crozet area and identified some key locations where improvements are going to be needed, both now and into the next 20 years. So keep your eye open for the upcoming events with Crozet. With some of the ongoing projects, I'll just point out we've had a number of sidewalk construction projects that have been struggling to the finish line recently, mostly because of increased costs that have come up in problems getting construction bids, but it looks like we are finally moving a bunch of those forward. We've identified the additional funds needed to re-advertise. Some of them have been re-advertised. Some of them are just about to be, but that includes Mountain View Mountain View School pedestrian crosswalk in front of that, which was funded through TAP, is already scheduled for construction in the next couple months. The shared use path out at the Albemarle High campus that connects between the middle school, the high school, and the elementary school out there is going to be moving forward very soon. And then sidewalk projects on Rio Road East, on Avon in the Mill Creek area, and out in Crozet with a pedestrian crossing of 250 right there in the it's in the area where the Harris Theater is on 250 on the south side of Crozet. Sidewalk and pedestrian crossing, all those look to be moving forward, as well as the Ivy Road sidewalks that go from the city line out to the UVA facility. Those all look like we found the money for them, and they're going to be advertised very shortly. So the good news on that front.
Hey, Kevin, where can I find that Crozet transportation plan?
Well, I'm reviewing the final draft of it. It'll be part of the Crozet master plan overall. So there isn't a publicly available copy right now because I've got a few edits to have them make, but I'm happy to provide everybody with a link to that once it is finalized. And like I said, it will be part of that Crozet master plan coming up.
Great, thanks.
Thanks, Kevin. Wow, that's a lot going on. Wild to hear so much infrastructure is going to Crozet. I feel like some people would be surprised. Stephen?
Just want to put one more thing in there too. The county has the rail corridor study going on as well. And I know that there's been discussion about extending that to the city line.
Great. Stephen, busy couple months of John. You got any updates for us?
Has been busy here. I don't know that there's much to share for this group. Lucinda did post a little earlier in the chat. There's a talk I'll be participating in on Thursday talking about affordable housing and transportation. So getting ready for that.
Great. Jeanette, any updates from the city? Here we got some big news yesterday.
Yes, so it looks like the appropriation of 4.2 million in state of good repair money that VDOT found for us will help Belmont Bridge move forward. So right now I'm trying to work with purchasing on getting that notice of award posted. So that's moving forward. We're thinking the contractor's very anxious to get started, so it could be as early as the end of June that you might see people out there. So it's Belmont. We had a Fontaine Design public hearing for that streetscape project that seemed to go over quite well. And that will be presented to City Council soon. And the city staff is also looking at our future smart scale proposals that we're thinking about for the city. Revenue share, we're not proposing to move forward with any of those. I don't know if anyone on the committee is well aware of what's going on with revenue sharing, but the past awards were pushed out 5 years. So in the last round, we were awarded funding in fiscal year 25 and 26. So this next round of grants would be for 27 and 28. And this is not how the city typically uses revenue sharing funds. It's to help with price escalation on projects that have gone over budget, or it's for small, short duration projects that can be quickly implemented. So trying to forecast out another 6 or 7 years is difficult the way the program is running now. So we'll be discussing that more with City Council on what's our strategy moving forward with that program.
And do we know what's driving that change?
It had to do with COVID and the budget changes and short revenue streams and all of that. But the last round, we were asked whether we wanted to accept or not, but we didn't really program in 5 years of escalation into our project requests, and some of them are prorated. So for East High, we're going to have to switch money with West Main. It's made it quite complicated. So the city is supportive of possibly suspending this program until we get back to where we can award the next year. That makes more sense for us. Not sure how the state feels about that.
Gotcha. And how does that affect kind of previous planned revenue sharing projects? I think it was phase 2 of West Main that was revenue sharing, right?
Yes, those awards were already done. So that schedule hasn't impacted. It impacted the schedule of East High Streetscape, of a turn lane extension on 250 eastbound, taking a left onto Hydraulic, and then a series of multimodal, basically sidewalk projects. So we're taking our city's priority sidewalk projects and pushing them out 5 years, which is not making anyone happy. So
Yeah, that's not great. Okay, well, I guess with that, we will pass it to Chuck. Thanks for the 4.3 million for the Belmont Bridge. Got any updates for us?
Like I said before, I've mainly been focusing on looking at contacting every locality to find out what they're looking at for smart scale for round 5. And we've been working on the the project pipeline project, identifying what those are and working with the localities to see if they would like us to look at those as studies moving forward. So that's primarily the focus. Like I said, those are going to be kicking off here shortly. And those are probably going to be our top priority moving forward for the near future.
Okay, thanks. And can you shed any more light on the revenue sharing deal? Like, do we expect it to go back to a 1 year out award in the future, or?
I don't know. It just depends on funding. I know for smart scale for this round, actually, we got the additional revenue, and then I think about 3 weeks ago, they actually reduced that revenue forecast for us by like 1.4 million. So I'm not sure how that's going to affect the other programs moving forward.
And will that affect the smart scale awards that were like tentatively made?
No, we had a surplus in our, in the recommended scenario. So we actually were looking at a few other projects that we were going to try to fund to use up all the funding. And we had to drop one of those, but it was in the northern part of the district, not down here.
Okay. Tim, do you have a question?
Yes, since we seem to have a little bit of time, just a question, because so many people here would know that. Where are we in the rural road cycle? And is there anything interesting that we should be looking forward to in the next couple of years on that?
And you want to talk about the
Kevin,
second?
you might want to answer this, or Buck.
Yeah. You mean the rural paving program?
Yes, and anything else in terms of rural road improvements, bicycles in rural areas like 76
Sure.
and that sort of stuff.
Sure. We've been working a lot with the residency about identifying within their routine paving programs what type of bicycle accommodations we can within this paving that we can package into this. A lot of it depends on width and shoulder if available. We've been evaluating within our recommendations from our bike ped plan and our current county regional data that shows us where we identified bicyclists are using these roads. Looking up we looked up this fiscal year paving, but also try to get ahead of the game with next year's as well. We got the list pretty late, but we're identifying what roads are on the paving program that would be adequate to request for any type of improvement. But also on a separate type paving, tomorrow evening we have a public hearing on the secondary roads paving of our gravel roads within the county. So these are roads that are not yet paved, but have been prioritized and petitioned to be paved. And the board will be, after the public hearing, approving the draft secondary 6-year plan. And again, this is roads that are on the rural paving list to be paved as rural rustics. We've been having a lot of input about these rural roads that are identified that are not paved, and gravel roads that are ideally used for the bicycling community. So we're seeing both sides of these and always pointing people to be able to make these public comment at our public hearing to their standpoint on this paving. So we'll see how the board, what direction they take, and they'll be having a public hearing tomorrow night.
Thanks. I've never been a proponent of Governor Kane's paving of rural roads and the bastardization of the rustic road program that developed in the Midwest that I think was really outstanding for multimodal. But that aside, that's just my editorial comment. I'm on Route 53 a lot, and I'm really excited about the thought of having bus service of one sort or another from downtown Charlottesville to Monticello. Where are we in any creative thinking about moving bicycles more safely and for the recreational vehicle as well as the commuter vehicle to Monticello, Ashlawn, Morven, etc.?
I think I'll let Sandy or someone speak about the transit study that would identify that, but I know 53 is going to be paved. But again, when we look at these improvements, it's really by what is already on their paving program, and it's not always the entire road segment. And so we're trying to have these conversations with the residency to see what is what would be the best accommodation within their and they have to look at their budget and everything like that. So we're at least identifying and bringing these to them with requests.
Just maybe this is another time and another topic that you all might want to bring to us. I don't want to cut into this, but you know, Bill's involved, a cyclist and a person who's quite aware of studies that UVA has done, maybe more theoretical, to move students to Morven. And there have been studies that would look at Morven to Ashlawn to Monticello without being part of the 53 corridor alternative. So I'd like to maybe suggest to you all that it would be an interesting topic for us to think about some of these more creative ways of multimodal. Thanks.
We also have our rural transportation meeting at 1 o'clock as well, if you want to attend.
Actually, on a similar note, real quick, I've been hearing a lot about this 3-notch trailer concept lately. Is there anything happening with that?
Nothing really. We've had some more internal discussion. We're aware of the public desire for that, and I think what we're trying to do now is to see if it can work into a future planning process, but nothing immediate right now.
Okay, thanks. So we'll go ahead, Chuck.
No, I don't have anything.
Okay. Sarah, we'll go to you for Rideshare.
Not too many updates for Rideshare. We are obviously promoting Bike Month and any Bike Month activities that are happening in the area, and going through the state system for that. They came up with a lovely little social media kit to put that out there. So it's still Bike Month. Keep biking. And you know, we'll be wrapping up the fiscal year next month, so just kind of looking at what we can do coming out of sort of COVID, and looking towards the future as folks are starting to return to work, and how we can make sure they understand all of their commute options, whether that's transit, biking, ride sharing with carpooling and van pooling. I think most of our van pools have, for the most part, went back to at least partial running schedules. So just always keeping on top of all of that.
Great. And I think it's Ride Your Bike to Work week. So those of you who
it is Bike to Work week, yes.
Jump on your stationary bike if you're not commuting nowadays.
Or do a quick bike around the neighborhood at lunchtime, or, you know, for your 15-minute break.
Sounds good. So I'll go to, I guess, the TJPDC and MPO. I'll throw it to all of you guys. Do you have an update? Lucinda?
Since we have time, I'm just going to share my screen. I wanted to let you all know about the event we're having on Thursday, the 20th. It's the Transportation and Housing event. It's with the Rural Housing Partnership. And it's we'll have Todd Littman from the Victoria Policy Institute and Stephen Johnson from JOT. And it should be really good. It's going to be focused mostly on transportation, but it's also talking about housing. So I did a little bit of research and I found that in our area, approximately 50% of people's income is spent on housing and transportation costs combined. And they're going to be talking about that and then strategies to kind of help support people in getting better transportation options through development strategies. And I also made some fact sheets over here for each area about the cost of transportation and housing in the region, just if anybody's interested in that. And I posted in the chat box a link to this page and some of the information and a link to register for the event. Sorry, I posted it too soon. I didn't mean to hit return on that. But anyways, I really hope that you'll share this information and we'll get as many people as possible to come to the event. I think it's going to be really good. Oh, and Diantha is going to moderate it for us, which should also be really good too. That's all. Thanks, guys.
Great, thanks. Any other updates, Sandy, Jessica?
Yeah, I'll just mention real quickly, Rory, that as we already talked about with the UPWP, we do have $20,000 unprogrammed right now. So as we're talking about some of these initiatives, some of these planning initiatives, specifically by Albemarle County and Charlottesville, we do have some opportunities to support things like the 3 Notch Trail, if that is identified by Charlottesville and Albemarle as a priority. So there might not be movement right now, but I think we do have the potential to be able to do that moving forward. And I know our staff would love to have the opportunity if that's a priority.
Great. And I'll just add from city, the comprehensive plan process that started in January 2017 is really picking up steam. Obviously, a lot of people are talking about the future land use map draft that came out this week, but I'd also point out that the chapter text for the comp plan drafts are also out. So take a look at the transportation and land use chapter text that will have a lot of implications for how people move around in the future. That's all I got. Does anyone else have any updates or anything to say?
I do have one more.
Yep.
The PDC is hiring for a regional transportation planner, so feel free, if you have networks that you want to communicate that with, please feel free to help us get the word out.
Sounds great. Last item on our agenda is matters from the public. I don't see any members of the public here. So with that, I will adjourn this meeting. Thank you all. Right on time.
Thank you, Rory.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a great day.
Thanks.